This is Fountainhead Forum 22. I'm talking to Vickie Karp. She has long been an activist for election integrity, which she was first inspired to get into this back after the elections of 2000 and 2004. She's worked with women like Bev Harris and worked with organizations like Vote Rescue. How are you doing, Vickie?
I'm doing fine, Chris. Thanks for having me on your show.
Vickie, I wanted to ask you, first of all, my mother was a poll worker for a long time too, so she certainly had her strong opinions on this. What do you think is the ideal way to do votes, and even these days?
I think it's always been a hand counted paper ballots, no computers, but using certain security protocols that are very basic but very simple to follow if you have honest people running the elections.
Yeah. So when you
I could describe that scenario if you like, but my group has done these elections for various organizations and even political parties.
So when you say paper ballots, do you mean literally somebody, marking I know, for example, my mother told me a story about literally they were voting on just a levy, and, it was literally just people would mark on the ballot yes or no, and, mark their X next to that. And they actually went through the ballots and counted them by hand. Do you mean something like that, or are you okay with something like
that's what I mean?
cards?
That is what I mean.
Yeah.
Exactly.
What about
Only, done a particular way. Done a particular way. For example, just a couple of points about how it has to be done for it to have integrity, because there's always a way to mess with ballots. But if you have the ballot box in the room and it never leaves the room where people have been voting all day, and at 7 o'clock, the ballot box does not go into a back room where people are counting in secret, which is essentially what's happening with electronic voting. The ballots are being counted in secret by computers, and nobody gets to see that, and you're just expected to accept the result. But if you have paper ballots in a ballot box and you keep the ballot box in the room where the voting's been going on all day, then you bring in fresh teams of counters who haven't been there all day, who have been trained, and you have them empty out the ballot box in full view of the public and any candidates who want to watch. And count the ballots and account for all the ballots. All the ballots have to be accounted for that were given out that day, whether they were spoiled, voted on, whatever, so that we know exactly how many ballots were in and how many ballots came out of that box. And you have two teams of people. We have the counter, or the reader. Let's call them the reader. And that's the person who reads down the ballot, that ballot was voted, and they have someone sitting next to them watching and looking at that ballot to make sure that what the reader is saying is accurate. Across the table is the tallier, and they're actually marking on a tally sheet the results of that ballot, and they have someone sitting next to them making sure that everything they're tallying is exactly what's being said by the reader. And you just do that until you get through all the ballots, and you can bring in fresh teams. It's not rocket science, but when you get to the end, you just keep going until you're done. And then you post the results at that, let's say, precinct, which are almost defunct right now because of voting centers. But that's the system that can work. It has worked for many years when it's done like I'm describing to you. And it's the way Vote Rescue conducted hand-counted paper ballot elections for several different organizations and even political parties.
Yeah, so you're not even okay with something like punch cards or something like that?
No.
Okay, yeah, so yeah, that's one thing also that has changed, unfortunately. I mean, for better or for worse. You used to vote in your precinct, and now it's we both live in Travis County. I mean, I can go to any polling place in Travis County and vote.
Mm-hmm.
That makes it easier for people to vote, but I think it also creates other situations.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I can remember, and my mother worked the poll for all those years, is I don't think any of my mother or any of those other poll workers ever asked for an ID because they knew who everybody was.
Well, that's becoming more important than it ever has been because of because of what's going on in our border, for example, but not just that. But I think I've always thought that we needed to have voter ID. We really should have some way of proving citizenship. You're not supposed to be able to vote just because you have an ID, and yet people seem to be able to do that.
Yeah,
You're supposed
I
to be a
agree
citizen
too.
of the country.
I think one of the things that's changed though too since my mother started is a lot of a lot of poll workers were just housewives who who went and worked on election day, and that was just one day, where they'd have to find somebody to take care of the kids. But nowadays, most poll workers are retirees, and I think that's I mean, it's fairly obvious that we don't have enough poll workers, and you know,
Hmm.
which I think is another issue. But who do you think is doing elections right now? I mean, is there anybody? I mean, I don't know if you've looked at elections all over the world or elections all over the country or anything like that.
I don't know. That's a good question. I used to know the answer to that in terms of what some of the other countries were doing, but I don't anymore. I haven't kept up with it to that level. In this country, I don't think anybody is. We're using electronics everywhere. Some states have better procedures even with electronics. Like I think Florida now has better procedures. They're still using electronics though for counting at the least. And anywhere you're using electronics, there's no reason to really trust for sure that the result is accurate. And I'd like to just go back to when I first found out about the vulnerability, not just the vulnerability, but the feature in the Diebold election software that I heard Bev Harris, who you mentioned when you were introducing me, in an interview she was giving, describe how she found the election software of the Diebold company, which now I think after a few sales is now Dominion, but I'm not sure exactly. They sell off to each other, just different
Yeah.
big companies and corporations, right? But at the time, this was around 2002 it was 2003 when I heard this, and this is when I first got interested in the subject. She was describing how she was researching for a book she wrote, which is available on her, I think still on her website, which is blackboxvoting.org, and about electronic voting machine glitches, as they were called, that she was starting to see pop up from the 2002 midterm elections. They were being reported around the country. So she was researching and got on the Diebold website and found that they had actually left their election software on their public website. She didn't realize at first what it was, but she saw these files that seemed to include real election results from the 2002 midterm elections. But it was just a massive group of files. So she downloaded. It took her. I was just reading this part of her book this morning. It took her about 2.5 days to do this, or something like that, or 44 hours. So that would be like a day and a half, I guess. And then she brought in some computer programming guys and other tech people to look at it with her, and they realized that, yeah, this really is their election software, and it included instructions for how to go in a hidden back door and flip results and get back out without detection. That is a feature built into that software. It was. And so when some people like to say, well, computers are vulnerable to hacking, well, yeah, they are. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious now. At the time we discovered this, or she did, and then some of us here followed her work and then met her and worked with her and promoted her work. We had a lot of skeptics there, especially engineer types who love their technology. And, oh, well, if you had this security feature or that security feature, nobody could do that. Well, if you're designing it to be hacked, that's a whole different story, isn't it? And we found that was the case with software of some of the other major electronic voting machines at that time. Sequoia was one of them.
Well, back doors, as they call them, aren't really that unusual. It seems to be something. If you saw the movie War Games years ago, those programmers were talking about, back doors are not secrets. I mean, everybody, they always design a system and they put in a secret password that only they know about. I mean, and the other thing about electronic voting, of course, is, one person could go hack, five different voting systems in 5 different states and do it all from one location somewhere. Yeah, you could tamper with hand counted paper ballots, but you'd have to go there and
Mm-hmm.
physically go there, and it'd be a lot harder to do. But I mean, I remember my mother used to tell me, at the beginning of the election day, first of all, everybody would look at the ballot box and see that the ballot box was empty, so that there were no ballots in the
Right.
box.
Yep. That's
And
right.
then
Mm-hmm.
and then there would be two locks on the ballot box, and she said one.
Mm-hmm.
So the Democrat gets a key, the Republican gets a key, and then they would both take the ballot box to the courthouse, and then they would open up the ballots there. So there was a lot of security involved. You know, I don't know if you can make it totally secure, but it does seem like we've swapped convenience, but we've gotten something that's not as secure. And of course, this was why Bush was so moving to reform voting, was because we all remember how long it took for them to decide what happened in Florida, which ultimately
Mm-hmm.
decided who was our president. I mean, I think it wasn't until, I believe, the middle of December that we finally got that the Secretary of State ruled on that and certified the election and said, yes, Florida's electoral votes go to Bush.
I have an interesting story about that. Dan Rather did a documentary about that included this story I'm getting ready to tell you. He investigated this, and I have a DVD I ordered, and I've got the video on this. But he was investigating electronic voting machines a few years after that election, probably in the early 2000s. And he went to the Sequoia company, which was the one I just mentioned as a secondary one, where they found this backdoor situation going on in their software also. But this was before that. So he went to investigate what happened with the ballots that created the hanging Chad problem, which led to electronic voting coming in big time by around 2002, I guess it was. Yeah, it's when they really started bringing it in, which is why Bev Harris found so many articles about it, because it was kind of new that it was being used widespread around so much of the country at that time. So Dan Rather goes up to this place in Ohio, I think it was, where the Sequoia headquarters is located, and he interviewed the people that made the paper ballots, because they also made paper ballots, and they made paper ballots, punch card ballots. Oop, I'm sorry if that was on my end. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're fine. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. All right. So they made the punch card ballots, a lot of which were sent to Miami-Dade County and some of the bigger counties in Florida, where they had these hanging Chad problems. And so he was talking to the people that approved the roll of paper, or it's sort of like a cardboardy type of, a thicker paper, right? That would go into those machines for punching. This is why I don't like punch cards. And so they would, there were a couple of people, or a few people there, who were in charge of looking at the actual rolls of the paper they used, and checking them for density and one or two other things, and then approving or disapproving these rolls of paper. Well, rolls of paper were being sent to them that they thought were inferior, and they'd get a big marker and write rejected, and they were laughing about how they also would put 4-letter words on the roll itself and send it back and say, no, this is inferior quality, it's too thin, or something like that. And because it would cause hanging Chads and all the Chad problems that we saw happen on when they were counting those ballots, trying to figure that out. And what was happening was that the management was sending back to them the same rolls of paper that they had rejected and telling them to go ahead and use them anyway. So they were being told by management to use inferior paper to make the ballots that created the hanging Chad problem. And so Dan Rather said, why do you suppose they would do something like that? And the employee said, well, we don't know, but we do know that they also were manufacturing electronic voting machines. They started doing that, but nobody was buying them at the time. So It appears that at least that company was responsible intentionally for creating a hanging Chad problem that led to widespread purchasing and even mandating what ended up being essentially a mandate federally to go to electronic voting, sort of a roundabout kind of way. That's really what ended up happening around 2002 or 3.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of subsidies involved, because voting and election law is something that's largely been determined at the state level or even the local level.
Right.
Vicki, one thing that really I find really interesting is you can remember, we all can remember in 2000 and 2004, it was the blue team who was complaining that the president, stole the election, and now we've seen it happen the other way, and it's and now the side that the sides have changed. It's almost as if people only care about election integrity when they're on the losing side, and I find that very, very troubling. I mean, you should care about election integrity no matter what side you're on.
I agree. We've always said it was a nonpartisan problem, and that's exactly right. It is a nonpartisan problem. I think what has happened that's so disturbing, and both sides have been, both of the parties have been guilty of it, I think. But I think that what has happened here in the last several years was just a massive attempt to make sure that Trump did not win re-election. That what appears to me to have happened is that the Democrats really got busy and came up with even some, besides the electronic, which is by itself sufficient, but other ways to manipulate elections. And I think Trump was correct when he said his election was stolen. Other presidential elections were probably stolen too, but I think his was. And there's so much evidence about it that just never got into the courtroom because of the politicization of a lot of the judges who didn't want to hear the evidence. So some people like to say, Trump's full of it. He's still claiming his election was stolen. There's so many ways that election was stolen. I mean, we're just finding out now because of Elon Musk and Twitter and all the Twitter files that the government was conniving with Twitter to censor information that would have affected that election, especially the Hunter Biden laptop information, which the FBI had in their possession, the laptop itself, for about over a year. And then right before the election, they get in touch with Mark Zuckerberg, and then they start having weekly meetings with the Twitter people and saying there's going to be some Russian disinformation about Hunter, about the president's family, and we really don't want this to get out because it could really influence things the wrong way. So they censor all this information, and then now everyone's, oh, by the way, this is true. And, surveys have been done on that, about just that one thing. And Democrats, people that voted for Biden, whoever they were, independents or whatever, were asked if they had that information before the election, would it have influenced the way they voted? And about 30% of them said yes. So you have government, related censorship of the vote. You have the Dropbox situation, which, have you had a chance to or know about the movie, the documentary by Dinesh D'Souza called 2000 Mules about the drop boxes?
I'm not a big fan of Dinesh D'Souza. You're talking about vote by mail, though, which I do think has its own potential for...
No, I'm not talking about voting by mail. I'm talking about the drop boxes right now.
I haven't heard about that.
And whatever you think of him, you might want to watch this because it's really very interesting and documented without question what happened there. And these are in, I think, most, if not all, the swing states in the 2020 election, where they were able to identify through the actual cell phones of the people that were doing this, the routes that they took, going back over and over again to drop boxes and dropping off dozens, if not hundreds, of ballots at a time. And some of them were photographed, but they had definitely established without a doubt that there were enough ballots stuffed that way into these drop boxes alone. Just that, could have influenced the outcome of the election in the swing states. Yep. So you have, also there was evidence that was brought out by Mike Lindell at a symposium that he held about the electronic side of things. And oh my gosh, there's just so much evidence. And but it never has really gotten to the Supreme Court. The cases have gone there, but they have not ever been heard by the Supreme Court. But there's a very interesting case that they have on their docket right now at the U.S. Supreme Court called the Brunson case. Have you heard of it?
No, I've not heard of the Brunson case.
this is the most interesting thing that's happened maybe in my lifetime in regards to, or certainly since I've been watching election integrity issues and learning about them. These three brothers did a lot of studying about election 2020, and they had their own doubts about it based on a lot of things I'm telling you. But what they did was they filed a case that the Supreme Court may hear. We'll find out. The Supreme Court has it scheduled for, of all days, January the 6th, meaning next week or whenever that is, 10 days from now, whenever that is, to conference and decide whether they're going to hear the case. And here's what the case is really. It has to do with January 6th of 2021, on the day that the electoral votes were being recorded in the House and they accepted the outcome of the election, as we know, and then so-called Insurrection Day. But what happened on that day, too, was something else that most people hadn't really thought much about, is that 100 different congressmen and women brought to bear on that day publicly or in the hearing that they had incidents of fraud that had occurred in their states that indicated that there could have been election fraud, there could have been foreign interference in the election, which I believe there was. But anyway, they made these claims that there were these cases being reported that were very credible from people in their constituencies. And this is what's interesting about this Brunson case. It's in the Constitution that if there are credible claims of potential fraud, especially potential election interference by foreign governments, that the Congress is supposed to take 10 days to investigate these claims before they approve of the electoral votes. And none of them did that. And not only did they not do that, they suppressed any attempts to investigate those claims. So what the Brunson case does is it says that everyone from Mike Pence down to every Democrat and even a lot of the Republicans too that voted that day to accept the Electoral College votes without investigating these claims was violating their oath to the Constitution and needed to be immediately taken out of their positions, fired, and forced to leave and never allowed to hold office again in any capacity in the United States of America. There are 388 respondents in this lawsuit, and the clerk at the Supreme Court was calling up these brothers and telling them, okay, you need to add this clause, you need to take this out, just to make it look, the way it's supposed to look, because they did it themselves. They did it pro se. They didn't even have an attorney, but they did a real good job. So, and so that it would also take Joe Biden out of office immediately and Kamala Harris, and as well as every member of Congress that voted, in favor of accepting the Electoral College votes as of that day. Pretty wild, huh?
Yeah. I'm curious, have you looked into 1960 any? Because I've certainly heard stories about Johnson doing things in Texas and, of course, Mayor Daley doing things in Chicago. Or do you have any interest in going back that far?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly I've looked at that in the past, and I know that there was fraud going on. I mean, I don't know personally, but I believe that there was, and I think there's always been fraud with elections, and so it really comes down to what we used to call, when I worked with Bev Harris, we used to call it, are you going to settle for retail fraud, or are you going to go wholesale and have electronic voting? You know what I mean? So at that time, there were no other options. You really just had the capability for retail fraud. I mean, bribes and stuffing ballot boxes, sure, all that can be done. And what I'm proposing, it can still be done there too. But it's just like you're saying, you have to physically be there to do that.
Yeah, dead people voting, things like that. There's a lot of different ways to do this. I mean, sometimes I wonder if maybe it's always been with us, but since all this is going on, where do you think we're headed with all this? Do you think the situation's ever going to get better? Or, I mean, I mean, I remember thinking before the election of 2020, I said, no matter who wins, the other side is going to say that this election was stolen. Are we going to have this with every presidential election? Or are we just, maybe if we just get, I guess we'll need enough of a landslide to see that happen, but nowadays we're at a point where any close election is going to be in doubt.
Yeah, that's true. I don't really know, Chris, what's going to happen, but I think there has to be some kind of a real major upheaval and change to our election systems. I think I'm not encouraging a revolution, but I am interested in what's going on in Brazil right now with Bolsonaro and Lula or Lulu, whatever his name is, that supposedly won that election. Okay, well, they used Dominion, I think, or some other type of voting machines there, and millions of people there think that election was stolen, and they're just not going to stand for it any longer. Maybe it just, it needs to reach a level where enough people are infuriated that they get in the street and they don't get out until the system has changed. I don't know. I certainly don't condone violence of any kind. I never have. I don't think that solves anything. But if enough people will accept that, oh, well, I guess there was some fraud here, but we're stuck with whoever for 4 years. Well, they had their way last time. We have our way this time. I guess we'll just handle it. I don't think that's any way to run a government. And I think that I think there's an agenda that's been at work in this country for a while, and I think that they've kind of grabbed hold of the reins of elections in the last couple of rounds here. Right now, I think I don't know how it's going to go. I mean, it's like watching a movie that you don't know the end to it, and you just hope for the best. And that's where I'm sitting right now. I know a lot of people know about this now. A lot more people know about it now than used to. But I don't know if people in positions of power that can do anything about it are able to, because I think there's threats and bribery and things going on behind the scenes that, for example, with Carrie Lake's, I mean, this is just my guess about Carrie Lake's recent case here about Maricopa County in Arizona. She was running for governor of Arizona as a Republican, and
yes,
there was every reason to think she was going to have a landslide victory. And there was so much fraud committed that day and kind of in broad daylight that which she proved part of in court, and the judge yet still turned down the case and said, you haven't really proved intentional fraud. Well, it's almost a joke. I mean, if you knew all the details of what she found and what she brought into court, she was given 2 days. She had 10 points that she was trying to bring to the court. The judge eliminated 8 of them and let her work on 2 of them, which were manipulation of or the ballot box, the counters actually were malfunctioning on election day, but not before, not early voting. And that turned out to be on election day, they were using a different size ballot. They had the same ballot information on it, but they went from using a 19-inch ballot to suddenly everyone was given a 20-inch ballot, and that screwed up the counters in about 40% of the county. That county has over half the population of the state of Arizona in it. That county makes up enough to change the numbers from Katie Hobbs to Carrie Lake. I mean, just that one thing. And then when people couldn't get their ballots to go through, they were saying, well, just put them in this little box here in the voting machine. And then the chain of custody, which I was referencing earlier, how important that is. You have to know how many ballots came in, how many ballots went out, and end up, if you have unvoted ballots, then you've got those sitting somewhere. You know how many there are there. People were election workers were just taking those out, some of them were, and not counting them and just mixing them up with other ballots from other machines. Nobody really had a count on them. And then they were delivered someplace else to be counted. So the chain of custody was absolutely atrocious, which calls into question every single one of those. So you have problems that are enormous, that are obvious, and that if a judge was really being fair and impartial, it's almost like, how could you not fine for her? But they didn't. So she's appealing it. You know, she's a real champion, and she's not giving up. I don't know how that'll come out for her, but I admire her intent for what she's trying to get done. I think she probably won that election.
Yeah, I don't know how this is going to play out. It seems like it's very, very troubling, and I don't know if anybody really cares about this, or and I don't buy into this dogma that newer technology is always better. And I think that's I mean, sometimes it is better, but sometimes it's not better. And I don't know. What do you think about vote by mail?
I don't like it, except for the military. And, you know, if somebody is truly has a medical reason why they can't show up on election day. Also, early voting, terrible. All that should be cut out. Election day should be a holiday. All the voting should be on election day, except for military and some mail-in ballots that are closely validated, where the identity of the person is closely validated. No ballot harvesting, where people go into nursing homes, like they proved happened in Houston, for example, more than once. They just go in there and they have ballots filled out a certain way, and they just ask these elderly people to sign them.
Oh, geez.
I mean, there are people going to jail for that, but that's nothing new. This is just another way, you know, to commit fraud. There's, like I was saying, there are countless ways. It almost gets interesting to see what do they come up with next. For example, another thing that happened in Arizona, I just remember this. I'd never heard of this, and I thought I'd heard of everything, but the mail-in ballots are supposed to have voter signatures validated compared to voter registration cards on file at the county. And they had AI, artificial intelligence, validating signatures on these ballots, which is illegal. That was not in the election code that the AI could do that. It's supposed to be human beings doing that. So that was tens of thousands of ballots that the signatures were validated by AI in Arizona. That alone should have caused the election to be thrown out, the results to be thrown out, and either Kari Lake given the win, or conduct a new election within, getting rid of all these problems, right? So anyway, there's always something new that they can do. It's just interesting how they come up with things.
I'm horrified by the prospect of having to sign to vote, because my signature is so inconsistent. I can see somebody saying, "Wait, that's not the same signature as you had on the signature card."
Well, I know there are a lot of people that have signatures like that, but I would rather have a human being comparing than AI. And AI is not in the election code allowed to do that. That's the main thing. If they want to change the election code and allow that, that's fine, I guess. But they hadn't done that, and they used them anyway. Is the problem. Yeah. And also in that election, one more thing I'll point out about that election, Katie Hobbs was the Secretary of State over there before this election. The Secretary of State is the state authority on how elections are held. She should have recused herself from that position, but she didn't.
Yeah, I believe the Secretary of State does that in most states.
That's right, they do.
But
Brian Kemp in Georgia, I'm not a giant fan of him, but he was Secretary of State when he ran for governor in 20. Let's see. I think it was this time. Yeah, that's right. Because he ran this time. Yeah. He recused himself. Somebody was Brian Kemp. He didn't. Yes, he did. He did do that. Not to say he's a great guy or anything. I don't know. I'm not sure what I think of him, but he did recuse himself, and that was the right thing to do, I think.
And that's a fairly logical progression too. It's, somebody who's Secretary of State in a state often does, set their sights on running for governor after they're out of that. So that's probably happens a lot.
Yeah, it probably does. So so you've got you've got all these different ways elections can be hacked now. Between you've got electronic voting, which by itself can do the job. You have the ballot box stuffing when you have the mail-in ballots, which some states now have all mail-in ballots or drop boxes. Chain of custody problems, signature verification, different sized ballots. And then you've got the whole voter registration system, which is completely screwed up, and that's where you have still dead people, like you were referencing. That's still going on. Dead people on the rolls. Some states mail out. I think Pennsylvania did this time in this last election here in November. They just mailed out ballots to tens of thousands of people that were on the registration list, but a lot of them had moved or were dead. And those ballots were just out there. People got them. Somebody got a lot of them, were delivered to somebody. So, it's a very messy system, that's for sure. And both sides of the aisle or both parties, like you're saying, should be concerned about it. I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, I mean, things like that are going to happen. People move. I mean, you go by whatever the address was. It's not, but that's another issue with voting by mail. I think that.
Well, but the thing about it is they sent these ballots out unsolicited. So the way that system is supposed to work is, let's say you're going to be out of town on election day and you want to get an absentee ballot, you apply for it, and if you qualify, they'll send you one. They don't just, you're not supposed to just get mailed out. They're not supposed to just mail them out unsolicited. That is an invitation to fraud. And I think they managed to, that got caught by somebody over there. And I think a court decision was made that those ballots would not be counted when they came back or something. But I don't know how they tracked that stuff at that point. I really don't know. So many interesting things that happen every election cycle. We're getting to be more plentiful every time.
Yeah, it seems like it seems like to me too, though, some of these things are almost been done in the name of enhancing democracy, but it turns out that maybe they're not really enhancing democracy. They're just letting people play games.
Yeah, well, they certainly are. There's no doubt about that. I think we're reaching a point where enough people understand the levels of fraud that are occurring, and it feels like we're reaching some kind of a breaking point, but I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't know, and it'll have to be a peaceful one to work. But I just don't think we can go on like this. It's just I remember back in the 2000s, I saw a statistic about incumbents in Congress I saw two statistics within a couple of days of each other that didn't make any sense when you compare them to each other. One was Congress's approval rating, which was at the time, and I can't remember what year exactly this was, but it was sometime in the I think it might have been after that bailout that happened in 2007 or 8 or whatever, the big crash. And then the big bailout that happened, and all that money going, just billions of dollars unaccounted for where it was going. We got to do this or the whole economy is going to collapse. So, Congress is just dishing out money to everybody like they like to do. The approval rating for Congress was something like 17%. And then we have the reelection rate of incumbents in Congress. And that's something like, that number was something like, and that was in the next election, something like 85 to 90% reelection rate. So it's like, well, how could that happen? You have a 17% approval rate. How can all these people get reelected? And that was something that it's only because the elections aren't, they're being manipulated, have been for a long time. And we were so naive about this when we found out about it, and we kept finding more and more and more and more evidence. And we did a press conference in Washington, D.C. with Bev Harris, and she showed, in fact, we were on a conference call with her after her book came out, and she was talking about which featured the hack and the Diebold election software hack, and she said, it's too bad we were getting ready to do this big press conference before the 2006 midterm election in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club. And we featured her, and she was going to demonstrate how this worked. She said, it's too bad we can't get a trained chimp, because I could train a chimp how to do this. It's so easy. And so my friend Abby Delosier, who I co-edited the book with, Hacked High-Tech Election Theft in America, came out in 2006. She said, well, I have a cousin who works in Hollywood, and I think he's got a chimp. Maybe we can actually get a chimp, and let's see if we can do that. And they did. They got this chimp named Baxter, and Bev flew to wherever he was. I don't know if he was in Hollywood then or not, wherever he was. Got a computer, keyboard, and got a computer, and showed this chimp, trained him how to do it, and made us a DVD of that, which was all of that was shown at the press club during that press conference, and everybody got a press kit that included the chimp Baxter hacking an election. There were about 80 or 90 members of mainstream media there. Yep. And we were looking the next day online to see how they reported on this. And none of them took it seriously. It was just like what you see these days. Most of the mainstream media I consider to be bought off and pretty worthless and not really worth giving any time or attention to. But at that time, we still had confidence in that. Oh, if we can just get this information to the right person, somebody's going to do something about this, But no, they reported it as a parlor trick that could never be recreated under real election conditions, which was totally untrue. And so we realized then that was the beginning of the loss of our innocence as to understanding the sort of Pollyanna attitude we had. It's like, oh, well, the right people just don't know about this. What about Jimmy Carter? He's a big proponent of fair elections and blah, blah, blah. We sent him all this information. We had somebody that was his right-hand person receiving all of it. He didn't do anything. When our book came out, we sent it to every member of Congress and the Senate. They didn't do anything. We went to our county, our city council, county, and we met with about 3 different secretaries of state in Texas. Nobody did anything. It's like, oh, okay. Now we understand. They all benefited from what's going on here. Why would they want to change it is really what it came down to.
Vickie, I'm a libertarian. We haven't even talked about how elections are rigged against independent candidates and third parties. I mean, and I kind of wonder now if the American people don't care about how elections are rigged against third parties, are they going to care about how other ways that elections are rigged? It doesn't seem like to me they are going to care. But
that's a good point. I think so, because unfortunately, most people identify with one of the two main parties and they don't give too much thought to third parties. They should. Why do we only have 2 real choices? I mean, it's ridiculous. That's a whole other topic, and it's a very interesting one. I'm not sure that people, focus on that as much as someone who is a third party member or supporter would. But yeah, the way third party candidates are kept off of ballots, for example, in a lot of states. I mean, it's crazy. And then candidates who aren't mainstream Republicans or Democrats who choose to run as a third party because they don't really identify as a Democrat or Republican. If they do that, it seems like they don't really have a great chance of winning. So they will pick one side or the other because that's where most of the votes are. And it shouldn't be that way. I agree.
Who are who are your most visible allies? I suppose Alex Jones talks about election integrity now and then. Who else?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Who else is out there about this?
Well, there's quite a bit of the alt media, as I would refer to them, which a lot of people who do watch CNN, MSNBC, or mainstream would probably consider those who are in alignment with what I'm saying to be conspiracy theorists, but I think that's why I love the Twitter files so much, because we're seeing what's really been going on, like behind the scenes, and it's been covered up in so many different areas, including the election. So I don't know. Maybe Elon Musk is. I'm not sure. Gateway pundit, Alex Jones. That's where I first heard Bev Harris on his show, and I know a lot of people think they have a lot of extreme opinions about him, but I think he's actually put out some interesting information over the years that has turned out to be true. I can't support everything he's done and said. Well, I can't do that for anybody, but there's so many different alt media people out there right now doing podcasts and radio shows. Stu Peters is one. There's a guy named LT who has a podcast called And We Know. I made a list of the media that I like to follow for somebody one time, and there's quite a few of them, but I just can't, they're not coming to my mind right now. But there are a lot of people out there who are aware of this kind of information and are in alignment with what I'm saying, basically, and know that we've got to make some major changes, because I don't think we are, like people like to say, we're not, our democracy is at stake. This is a democratic republic. It's not a democracy, for one thing. It's a democratic republic, and we're losing it, is what I think, in large part because of elections, but that's not the only reason. But I think that's when the wrong people get in office, policies take place that the people don't want, and the people can't vote out the bad guys. And that's where I think we are right now.
Yeah. Where do you think we're going to go from here? I mean, do you think it's really possible to have a clean system when you have such a large country? Also, I mean, I don't know if you ever. I mean, I suppose there are situations where in that town of 1,000 people where elections might get stolen, but it seems like it might be harder to do it in a smaller town. But I can't say for sure. But I mean, do you think maybe the problem is that when you're electing an executive and you have millions and millions of votes,
mm-hmm.
I mean, is there more potential for corruption with that? I mean, can you have large elections, period, or should you just keep your elections small?
Well, that's a good point, and it brings to mind one of the recommendations that we at Vote Rescue made way back when we came up with these other ideas about just the basic how to run a good election, is get rid of these voting centers where you can just walk in anywhere and vote. Yeah, very convenient, but it complicates things when it comes to the accountability issue. There are just a lot of complications that it creates on the execution end, logistical end, and transparency end. And so breaking it back down, going back to the precinct level, creates like the equivalent of the small town voting, election situation. You have an election that's run where everybody's voting in their precinct, and then you do have your neighbors helping run the election potentially, although that's not a requirement. But when everything's done at the precinct level and the votes are counted at the precinct level before they go up the chain, and they're counted in the same room as I was describing, we're using a system something like what I was describing. You have video cameras on the count. You have candidates, if they want to stand around and watch. You have voters standing around and watching, which is something that Vote Rescue did. Since you're a libertarian, I mentioned this in my bio that I sent you, but we executed the state for state candidates for the Libertarian Party. We did a hand-counted paper ballot election for them several years ago. It was at the Temple Convention Center, and that's how we did it. There were cameras on the count. They had big screens up on the wall, so people couldn't get close enough to the count. They could see in real time what was being tallied. And when we got done, everybody knew who won and everyone knew who lost, and nobody thought that the election was stolen. Nobody. They were thanking us, So I'd love to see more of that.
Yeah.
That was my favorite part of election integrity work was doing those elections and showing people
Yeah.
how a high integrity election, what that feels like to vote in and participate in. And our volunteers always loved it too, because it was just an empowering situation to participate in and also to take part in as a voter.
That's one thing that takes some of the shenanigans out, though, and I've been to, various conventions, is if you have, a roll call vote, or just, vote by people raising their hands or vote by people standing up.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to mess with a system like that. I mean, secret ballots in themselves can create potential for shenanigans. I mean, okay, he had 15 hands go up, he had 10 hands go up, and everybody can see that. It's you're
Yeah,
not.
I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for that, but there's still such a strong feeling, I think, about the privacy of the vote itself that I'm not sure if doing
Yeah.
transferring that method all the way over to that would ever really take hold. But there's a lot to be said for it. You're right. It's hard. You can't hack that.
Another thing too, Vickie, it goes faster. When I was lived in Columbus with the Franklin County Libertarian Party in Ohio, we elected all of the county officers, just by raising our hands. Come down to Travis
Mm-hmm.
County, we go to the county convention, elect all the people for county offices by secret ballot, and it takes a lot longer.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, it does. It does take longer. I agree.
and this was only,
But it doesn't take as long as it does to count ballots coming in overnight, over and over and over and over and over again for 3 weeks, after an election day, like that, what they just did in Arizona. Absolutely criminal, I think, what they did. But it is a state by state issue. The Constitution right now gives that authority to the state. So, I'd like to, if the federal government could come up with one way of doing things that was really transparent, that would be awesome. But it's not constitutional. It has to be left to the state. So you hope for a good governor and secretary of state, which I think in Arizona that's a lost cause right now for the next 40 years or whatever. But there are faster ways of doing things. But again, speed isn't everything, but it certainly beats what they're doing with a lot of these. When you have 3 to 4 weeks of early voting and you have ballots that keep coming in and coming in and coming in and dragging things out like that is just ridiculous. And it's just ripe for trifling and manipulation. And probably that's what happened and is happening.
I know there's been some talk about some blockchain voting systems. I haven't looked into them, but have you looked into them? Because this seems to be maybe ways to computerize things, but a way to clean out the corruption using blockchain technology. Do you think that's a solution, or have you looked into that much?
Well, I have heard of it, and I'm familiar with I'm somewhat familiar with the concept. I don't know exactly how it works. It is a computer technology, and I know that the libertarians used blockchain. Somebody came to them with a blockchain system for their next election, and they went with it. And we heard later that they were really sorry that they did that. But I don't know. But I used to be familiar enough with it that I could tell you what I saw as the problem, or what it seemed to me to be the problem. I don't have that on the top of my head anymore. But when it comes down to it, I don't think computers should play a part in elections. I just don't. And whether people want to consider that a Luddite viewpoint, or they can if they want to. But look what's happening now. Look where we are now with these computers.
I know what you're saying. Yeah, we had our own issue back in 2020, of course, because all of the conventions got, the LP National Convention was supposed to be in Austin, but then, other things happened, and you have these deadlines, and I don't really know, if they even necessarily had the authority to do this, but they said we have to nominate our ticket, by this deadline. And so the nomination went virtual. It was not, it was LP National Nominating Convention via Zoom, and then the votes were on Zoom or whatever, Zoom, Discord, whatever, all that got virtualized because I mean, they probably possibly could have nominated the ticket live in person in Florida, but then still there were, you know, restrictions on whether or not some people could have come. But also, we could have very well missed some deadlines in some states because of that,
Mm-hmm.
and then not been on the
Mm-hmm.
ballot. I just thought, you know, I mean, I wasn't part of the decision making process, but I just thought, I do consider, you know, having our presidential candidate on all 50 states to be pretty sacred. I mean, that's something we got to aim for, in my opinion. But
Mm-hmm.
it was
Yeah.
crazy how all this happened, and I don't think they ever want to go back to but they could have maybe put in a virtual provision in case there is an emergency. But, you know, nowadays things are still, and you also have the travel costs. I mean, it's unfortunate, but political participation does, you know, there are monetary barriers as well, because people can't get there, or they can't fly, or whatever, or they can't afford to fly sometimes. So.
Yeah, that's true. I do think that with COVID came a great excuse to keep everyone out away from voting in person, which there were genuine, and have been and still are genuine, health threats there. But I think it was just also a convenient way to bring in all this mail-in voting, and anyway, it created these new and better ways to commit fraud in elections. Whether that was intentional or not, who knows? But nothing would surprise me. But, well, Chris, I'm afraid I'm going to have to run right now. I've got an appointment coming up. But was there any last question or comment for me?
Any last comments you want to say, Vickie? You've got a couple books. Let's mention your books out there before we go.
Well, we have, there is a book, our book that we co-edited. It was written we had chapters donated by experts at the time, when we're talking about 2006 now, 2007, but it's called Hacked High-Tech Election Theft in America, and it may still be, I think it's still available on Amazon. I end up fulfilling that myself when an order comes in. It's, I would say, although that's an outdated book at this point in some ways, the fundamentals are all in there as to what Bev Harris wrote about her discovery of the Diebold software, and she did a couple of chapters, and other people that were working on this. We had great people around the country, different states working on this, and several of them donated chapters to that book.
Well, even though it's out of date, I hope you make an effort to do it electronic. I mean, it's an easy way to make. It may not sell much, but it's an easy way to get some money. So, okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it, Chris.
Yes, and she is a
Have
real
a good one.
So if you need to buy a house, call Vickie. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Chris. Bye.